All I have to do at this point is to introduce my wonderful colleague, Professor Katie Einstein, who's a terrific scholar, is the person who, one of the people who is behind the survey of mayors that you've heard about, along with our colleague David Glick, who's also at the table over there. And Katie is a daughter of the Badger State and is appropriately going to introduce Mayor Soglin.
So Mayor Soglin, who we are thrilled to have here today, has been elected the mayor of Madison, Wisconsin a total of 8 times. During his 17 years in office, Mayor Soglin has maintained a commitment to equality and developing a tax base that can support human services. His many accomplishments include investing in Madison's mass transit, making it have a ridership that is competitive with cities 3 times its size. He has also developed Madison's first bike routes and lanes. He has helped implement the design and construction of the State Street Mall, resulting in one of the strongest downtown locally owned retail sectors. And he's worked on the development of Madison's Civic Center. Moreover, Mayor Soglin has spearheaded a variety of innovative policies that foster public-private partnerships and has tirelessly promoted greater transparency in governance. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Paul Soglin.
Thank you, and my apologies if this presentation is disjointed. It was well thought out at about 8:30 this morning, and after the last 2 panels, I've rewritten it about 5 or 6 times because of the wealth of information and how relevant it is to the future of America's cities. First, I want to apologize really sincerely that I can't stay. I've got to spend at least 1 day this week in Madison, which will be tomorrow if I can get back tonight. But there are other things happening that cities are working on. And I want to emphasize that when we talk about municipal finance, we really have to have an understanding of quality in terms of performance. It's not just a question of can we sustain existing services. It's not just a question of what revenues are available and how do we fit that into the limitations imposed by our respective states. I'll just give you 2 examples. And here, in Wisconsin, we do operate with very strict controls on both our expenditures and our ability to raise revenues. But unfortunately, the Emerald Ash Borer doesn't respect our state legislature, and it will move rapidly through the Midwest, as we've discovered in the recent years, and we're going to have to take down well over 100,000 trees. If you're old enough to recall what we went through with Dutch elm disease, we're about to repeat that in the Midwest. And it's not just a question of taking down the trees and disposing of them, but it's also a question of doing the analysis from the standpoint of looking at all the externalities as to whether or not we replace those trees. And I can tell you without reservation that they must be replaced. And those are costs which are borne within the capacity of our existing budget, which are not recognized by the limitations and the controls. Another example of what I'm talking about is the question of high-speed fiber. And here I can spend an entire hour on the issue, but it's sufficient to say that we're one of the 19 states where AT&T and the existing telecoms bought our state legislatures in regards to limiting our ability as a municipality to encourage and invest in a system which right now doesn't have 1/100th the capacity of what's available in Paris or Seoul or Chattanooga or Winston, North Carolina. And let me just spend a moment on Winston, North Carolina, because the question, as Ted Lowy addressed some 40 or 50 years ago, is what is the role of government in terms of regulation, in terms of distribution of resources, and in terms of redistribution. Now, in Wisconsin, we were able to provide electricity to the most remote corners of the state because of state regulation, which said if you are going to get the franchise to be in the public right-of-way, you must go into the poorest urban neighborhoods and you must serve rural Wisconsin, which maybe for the utility company wasn't the most profitable model, but it did guarantee for the entire state that we would bring agriculture and some urban communities into the 20th century. In Winston, they went about the business of trying to figure out how to bring high-speed fiber and connectivity, and they went back 100 years, because 100 years ago in North Carolina, there was no ability to convince the electric utilities to provide electricity to their community. So they and the surrounding communities went into a consortium and in turn created their own municipal electric utility, which now gives them a foundation now to provide high-speed fiber, which of course, as soon as the North Carolina legislature heard about that, enacted legislation which is designed to deprive them of the revenues to pay the bonds for this endeavor. In the meantime, back in Wisconsin, we have the lovely competition between Charter, AT&T, Dish, and everybody else, private sector working its best, convincing us every 6 months we should change providers. They'll give us a 1-year discount, and we can move back and forth. I have wonderful choices. Yes, I've got AT&T this year. I'll have Charter next year, and on and on. And under this business model, I'm never going to get high-speed fiber because our municipality has all these roadblocks in front of it imposed by a state that, under the sham of providing competition, has taken away from us the ability to not only have franchises as we once did, but also to enter into partnerships with the private sector. I lay all this out because so many of the decisions which impact the economic vitality of our communities and our ability to raise revenues are related to our ability to regulate, to distribute, and to redistribute. It relates to our ability to have some control over tax and fee policy and land use. They are all interrelated. And yes, we will not get involved in battles to lure businesses into our city and giving them tax breaks. All the studies have shown conclusively that if you get into that battle, it is a race to the bottom. And within the last 4 years of my most recent mayoralty, we've lost 2 businesses. We've lost 2 businesses, but I can tell you that the gain in not getting into that kind of behavior and not encouraging it in other businesses is well worth it. If you don't want to play by our rules, you can go to Middleton. We have a Middleton too. Or then go to your Middleton. Also want to draw a distinction and get into the discussion of one of the questions that was raised earlier about fees and taxes. It's not just a question of revenues, it is a question of fairness and equity in how we raise money for government. And of course, what is happening is we are shifting from taxes to fees, which in most instances in most instances, are less equitable. But as Professor Rashofsky mentioned in the response to one of the questions, the fee does not always have to be inequitable. And in fact, in dealing with the problem of the emerald ash borer, we've come upon a fee to pay the $750,000 to $1 million that we will need every year for the next 10 to 15 years. And that fee is based on your lineal footage of your property. There's going to be a discount for those of you with corner lots. But what we are going to do is use that fee, and one of the things we had to do, another stab at the state legislature, one of the things that we had to do was we had to rush it into law and get it enacted before they came into session and could enact a statute to ban it. But at least in that instance, it's tied to something related to equity, which is the notion that it's your real estate, and hopefully there is some kind of correlation between the length of your frontage and your ability to pay. Before I go into any more detail, I also want to mention the problem of data. I was discussing this with Professor Rashofsky over lunch. We just don't have a lot of good data. And if we're going to do a good job in analysis over the years, looking at what trends are taking place within our communities, what plans and programs we have adopted are effective, we have to be able to track this stuff. The best thing we've got is the Census Bureau, the ACS, which, let me just note that right now, I don't know if this is one of these things that we do in the city. Every year I ask everybody to make cuts, and every year the police department comes up with school crossing guards, and the Parks Division comes up with lifeguards, both of which they know I couldn't survive another 6 weeks in office without restoring them. Right now, they're discussing eliminating the annual ACS work at the Census Bureau. I don't know if that's to scare us all. Part of me says go ahead and do it. Most of the data is irrelevant and worthless. Part of me says we've got to have it. Not only do we have to have it, but we can't rely on 5-year averages. We can't wait 10 years to see what's effective. We've got to have current, accurate data, and that means an investment of tax dollars. So what are we faced with right now? And I want to go again back to my state. I'm sure it's a conversation that's been repeated between municipal officials and state legislators in other states. And it went something like this, which was my imploring the need for greater state assistance in regards to public transit. The legislator, which kind of surprised me, acknowledging that public transit was a viable service. And then when we got into the discussion of financing, he starts out explaining to me that he's polled his constituents and they're against raising any of the necessary taxes, needed to properly fund public transit in the state of Wisconsin. I respond with all of the economic benefits, all the studies, and by the way, I can recall a study done just a couple of miles from here in 1967. I don't know if they're still around. Charles River Bridge Associates. Anybody ever hear of them here? Anyway, I was freshly elected to the city council in 1968, read this report from the Charles River Bridge Associates, and it basically said, give everybody free ridership in public transit. Given the cost of the automobile, the cost of parking, the cost of maintaining the streets, the cost of repairing and replacing them, and you're better off in public transit. So I brought up a 50-year-old study or whatever it was at that point with the legislator, and again he replied that he didn't have the capacity, and the key here is the word will. He didn't have the will to address these issues, at which point I pointed out to him that the reason his constituents were against raising taxes is because he had spent his entire political career arguing that we needed to shrink government, that we needed to lower taxes, and that this was the bane of economic development, which, by the way, we all know is not true. That in fact, as the studies are pretty conclusive, successful economic growth comes from public investment in infrastructure and in human capacity. And that is what leads to the private sector investing and creating jobs. And if you want proof of it, I submit to you, build an interstate highway, put in an interchange, and the day after it's completed, there's going to be a Cracker Barrel, and the next week there will be a mobile gas station. Now, I'm not sure that the cost-benefit relationship is worth it, but it makes the point. So we've got this problem of limited revenues along with constraints on how we can spend the money. And what it's done is it's forced governments to make bad decisions. And by the way, how Rahm Emanuel could run for re-election in Chicago with a commitment to not raise taxes in light of all the mistakes, and I say this as someone who was born and raised in Chicago, in light of all the mistakes of the recent decades, the selling off of the Skyway, the selling off of the parking system, which is an absolute disaster because you have to consider the effect on retail merchants, not just the ability to collect fees. To do all that with the pension crisis is beyond me. Somebody has got to raise taxes, and well, we'll get to that in the next paragraph. So, what are some of the practices that we're seeing? Practices that occur in cities with historically fine programs and standards for budgeting, for financing. And I refer to not just Madison, but other cities around the country. We're seeing one-time revenues used for the operating budget. It's just a no. You don't do it. And if you don't know why, we've got several undergraduate courses. The use of premium that comes from borrowing, a relatively recent phenomenon of the last half a dozen years. The use of premium should either be to make a downstroke on your debt service or to pay cash for a capital budget item. You cannot use premium for your operating budget, even though it's allowed under most state statutes that prevent such gimmickry. The converse, using capital budget revenues to fund the operating budget. Now, I perfectly understand the legitimacy of borrowing tens of millions of dollars for street projects and using a portion of that to pay for your salaries for the engineers who are going to be doing the design work year after year. And you better realize, of course, that if you ever stop doing that, one day you will have to face up to the fact that you may not be able to fund them. But as long as you're building highways, you're all right. The point is, there are all these gimmicks that are so basic and fundamental that are being practiced by politicians at all levels. And of course, the higher you go, the worse it gets. State governments, some of them, well, let me just mention the fact that in terms of a reserve fund, an undesignated portion of our budget, when we had $15 million in our fund a few years ago, the state of Wisconsin had less than $1,200. So who are they to lecture us on the issues of sound financing? But the point is this: we're in an era where political opportunism, the need to get reelected, is not at all connected to the wisdom that's necessary to manage a city and to manage its finances. And we have electorates, and I love them dearly, at least 72% of them in Madison as of 3 weeks ago. I'm not sure they feel that way now, who vote on those hot issues, the ones that push the buttons. Choice, gun control, gay marriage. And I pick out those three because I have very firm opinions on all three. And I too would have a difficult time if the candidate who agreed with me on all three were to come before me and I was to say, no, I'm not voting for you because you are irresponsible when it comes to public finance. But that's the dilemma that we've got today, which I think has been fueled by the politicians, the elected officials themselves. That's the crisis of today. How, like our state legislator, do you extract yourself from an environment that you've created where the public says we don't want taxes raised, and you're going to go up before them and now say raise a half a cent or whatever in regards to a sales tax. So where does this come from? Where did it originate? The Koch brothers didn't invent it, but they've certainly perfected it. What we're dealing with is a struggle in this country over who is going to run things. That's what it's all about. And run things at any price. If you're on the conservative side, you want to break the unions. It's that simple. Take away the political base for the Democratic Party. And if you're going to break the unions, you've got to break public spending. In addition, if the public conducts the work, say we do our own engineering services in our municipality, for streets, for sewers, that means those public dollars are not being spent where someone can make a profit in the private sector. And by the way, when I was, I can't even say I was a colleague. I never felt that I had the academic academic qualifications to stand next to Graham and to Andy. But when I was teaching courses at the University of Wisconsin's La Follette School of Public Affairs, I taught one on public enterprises and privatization. And as far as I can tell, there are less than a half a dozen courses in the United States that address this very fundamental question, which is at the heart of our debate. So in any case, what we're faced with is an ideologically fueled system. Your local government, the state government, and even the federal government, which is not based on sound fiscal or financial thought, and which is depriving us of taking advantage of the kinds of partnerships and the wise expenditure of funds. I want to just conclude with one more thought. In the 1970s, and to this day, continued surveys have been done about why businesses locate in particular communities. And while taxes are always an issue, when you have a heart-to-heart and in-depth analysis with the CEOs, taxes are usually 7th or 8th on the list. The top two, what are they? And they can flip. They want an intelligent, trained workforce. And secondly, they want a community where they want to raise their own children. That's the standard. Look at the runaway plants, if you call them that went from Manhattan to the suburbs in the 1970s, as documented in that New Yorker, New Yorker? No, it was New York Magazine article by William White, who eventually used it in a chapter of his book called Cities. So we've got some challenges. I wasn't able to get into the issues further of equity, but I just want to say that it's a real challenge to bring equity to our communities in an era, in a time with these very few resources necessary to deal with 5 fundamental areas. They are housing, education and job training, transportation, quality, not just child care, but quality child care, and health care. Thank you.
So since we only have a little bit of time left, I will ask one quick question, and then we can turn things over to the audience so that everyone gets a chance to jump in. So since you concluded by talking a little bit about equity, I thought that would be a great place to start. Can you just tell us a little bit about what some of the challenges are with implementing equity-oriented policies? And in particular, do you think there's a trade-off between equity and promoting economic growth or promoting your city's tax base? Are these at odds?
If our cities were to have a thunderstorm and millions of dollars of gold were to land in the city streets, we'd feel foolish not scooping it up before it washed away. In our cities, there are tens of thousands of people who don't have the access to those 5 basic elements that I just described, and we are losing this tremendous economic potential and growth. And I'll give you one example. Most of our cities, low-income neighborhoods, do not have reasonable public transportation as we find in upper-income neighborhoods. That deprives people from getting to work. It deprives them from getting to educational sources. And that's just one example how, if we're not looking at the distribution of resources in setting up a public transit system, a community can be hurting itself as well as its residents in terms of economic development.
Well, all right. Do we have oh, beautiful. We have multiple microphones. All right. So let's open it up to the audience. Do folks have questions? Anyone?
Hi. You were complaining about the way that the legislature hamstrings your city, and I know that's a common issue across a lot of places, but do you think that cities in states where there's a stronger tradition of home rule, do you think cities are doing better, or do they have different problems?
Yes. I mean, I would love to work under the constraints that you have in Massachusetts. As difficult as you may find them, Massachusetts is in far better shape than probably 30 or 40 other states in the U.S. And it came out in one of the first couple of maps that we were looking at, which showed local authority in regards to revenue raising, for example. It also shows up in regards to state governments controlling a whole number of aspects, such as what a municipality can do to award a franchise for telecommunications in the public right-of-way. The real challenge now is to get state legislatures to understand the nature of economic development. They're not developers. They really aren't. The only thing they know is giving away state money to lure a plant from another state. That's about the only tool they've got. And also, in some instances, tax discounts for employers for creating jobs. And we're not even discussing necessarily the quality of those jobs. That to me is not real economic development. That's moving around the chairs on the Titanic.
Other questions? Back somewhere?
Thanks very much. Enid Slack, University of Toronto. It's a variant of the question I asked earlier this morning. You mentioned Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, running on a no tax increase platform. In the city of Toronto, we had an election last fall, three major candidates, one to the right, one to the left, one in the middle. They all said they won't raise the property tax more than the rate of inflation. You know, we say in economics, finance follows function. We have to figure out what we want to be as a city, what services we're going to provide, and then we figure out how to pay for them. But we seem to be doing it in the reverse by saying this is how much tax we'll levy, what can we get for it? How do we break that mindset?
Well, the first thing we do in Wisconsin is we change the state laws and give me the ability to raise taxes. When I started out in public office 40-some years ago, approximately, I think it was 40%, 38% of the city's budget came from the property tax. We are now over 75% of our revenues are coming from the property tax. Now, along the way, we lost federal revenue sharing, but that was not significant because we were prudent in those days, and we used federal revenue sharing only for capital budget items, knowing one day it might disappear. But the point is, given what the state has done, which is what's really created the greater dependency on the property tax, I would not raise it. I would not raise it more than rates of inflation or growth of our tax base. But what I would do, given the authority, is I would certainly have a local work tax. But being more realistic, what I'm really looking for is a sales tax. And I'm pretty confident with the studies that show that people are not going to jump jurisdictions in terms of retail shopping for more than a ½ cent difference. And we could raise about $40 million in Madison with a ½ cent sales tax, and I'd do it in a heartbeat.
Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion.
Sorry, you did it. Sorry, yeah.
A couple of years ago, Madison had a task force about exploring pilots, payments in lieu of taxes, and I was curious where that's gone or if it's going to go anywhere.
We took a look at pilots. We patterned it right after what happened here in Boston, and we got such a bad feedback, principally from the hospitals, and we don't have the bevy of educational institutions in Madison that Boston has. We've got the University of Wisconsin, which through the state, even though it's not, even that's another where they've trimmed their spending. The state made payments in lieu of taxes for the UW. We didn't have the base, and considering that we had so many fewer resources in terms of nonprofit institutions, that we decided not to pursue it. How much time do we have? Are we over? Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion, and again for Mayor Soglin for his participation.